welcome everybody to our May 12, 2014 work session. Let me go ahead and read my little spiel, Chris, and I'll let Chris give us a quick update. Just so for the audience, the work sessions are a more informal setting to update the council on business items. No votes will be taken on any of these items tonight. Tonight we've got 4 items on the agenda. Public comment is allowed that is germane to an agenda item. If you wish to speak, you're asked to fill out a public comment card and turn it into our city clerk right over here. Public comment will be allowed for a total of 10 minutes per agenda item and no more than 2 minutes per person. Public comment will be heard at the beginning of each item, and once the item's called, no more comment cards will be accepted. So just, I'm going to let Chris give a little update, but if anybody else wants to speak on an item, just you'd fill out a yellow public comment card and give it to Sudi. All right, Chris.
Great.
Go ahead.
Great. Mayor and Council, I want to give you a quick update before we get started on a topic that's not on the published agenda, but is one that we've talked about at numerous meetings prior to tonight. And I just want to give you kind of a status update. I need to do it tonight because I have to take a position at a meeting that's going to occur before we all get together again. So this one deals with the public safety radio system and the tower facility that is being contemplated by Fulton County, and they want to put it at the property that they have that has the Freemanville water tank on it. You can picture that site. It's on Pritchard Mountain. The water tank's at 150 feet. To bring you, and to bring those in the public that might want to play along, to bring you back to where we started this discussion was the fact that Fulton County wanted to build this tower, and they wanted to put their infrastructure on it, put their assets on it, but they also wanted to allow the radio authority, of which we are a part, to use the facility as well for our equipment. There was an initial plan that was presented to us, and you all took a vote and elected to support that plan as long as 5 different criteria were met on it. And we delivered that letter to Fulton County, and if you remember, that was when the compound itself was within the 2 parallel lines of the existing compound for the water tank between the tank and Freemanville Road. Some of the things that we negotiated for were a tower that wouldn't be lit, meaning it had to be less than 195 feet, less than 200 feet, that it was with our support to the placing of it on the property, certain other aesthetic qualities that we conditioned it to. And we got a different map back. And we got a different map back after Fulton presented that plan and that letter of support to their water department. Water Resources is a different department. And they said, well, we can't build that. That's a great picture, but we can't build it. And the reason we can't build it is because there's water lines that run under the ground where it was being asked to go. And we don't want to put a crane out here and put pressure on those water lines. That's just way too risky to do that. So they told the county that if they were going to put it on that site, they needed to locate it as close to Freemanville Road as they could and as close to the northernmost part of the site as they could. So if it was sitting within those 2 parallel lines, picture just moving north, almost to north to the property line. As you recall, we saw a map that had it on the property line. We quite quickly objected to that because of its location to the adjoining neighborhood, and we quite quickly withdrew our support of that particular location. And I had the opportunity to meet with the county manager and the city manager from Sandy Springs, who's the chair of the radio authority. John and I visited with the county manager on Friday. And we could argue whether or not I've ever seen this map that they provided on Friday again before, and that's the map that's in front of you tonight. They say that we saw this one in February, and I don't recall seeing it in February. But this one is a little bit better than the one that we just outright rejected and elected to oppose. This one, you can see, pulls the compound further to the south. It pulls it off the property line by 15 feet. All of this is just by way of background. You're going to find out here in a second that it really doesn't matter what we decide to do tonight. I think this plan is going to move forward. But this is the plan that's currently on the table. This is the plan that Water Resources says is viable for the site. And this is the plan that Fulton County wants to build. I've asked them to continue to look at it and find alternate suitable solutions, see if there's a way to bring it further south. They simply have suggested that they can't. The one thing that we control in this whole process ultimately is the building code. And if Fulton County comes in to apply for a building permit for this tower, we will review it against the building code for code compliance as far as safe construction, as far as wind loading, as far as all those good things to make sure that the plan is in compliance with the building code. But I've confirmed, and before I brought it forward to you tonight, I wanted to confirm with the city attorney that the telecommunications ordinance, which we might otherwise regulate this type of a facility with, is not applicable to Fulton County building a Fulton County asset on Fulton County's property. So we can sit here and saber rattle and beat our chest all night, and we still aren't going to have the latitude to do anything but apply the building code to the construction documents when we get them. So I'm here to report that tonight, that we have, I think we've, to the extent that we've represented our citizens as well as we could, when we weren't at the table negotiating, Fulton had elected to turn this into a revenue stream. They have applied with the FAA to put a 400-foot tower in this location. It's an absolute monster. We've negotiated that back to the 195 feet. They were on the property line, and although we would like to see it shifted 100 feet to the south, they've shifted it 15. That doesn't seem like an equitable compromise, but it does also represent what they've said is the only place on this site that they can build. So there's a couple of soft wins in there for Milton. I have absolutely encouraged, and one thing we'll look for is that the tower is built to a standard that if it should fail, and I said that's a big if, towers typically don't fail, but if it should fail, it would fail either upon itself or fail to the south, so that it would fail away from any adjoining residential area. And then they have indicated that to the extent we want to talk about stealth technologies, they would be willing to have that discussion, although a 195-foot pine tree would clearly be taller than everything else around it. So the good news is we were able to find a location, or they were able to find a location where there's already a 150-foot object in the sky, so it's not as though this is a view shed that's pristine that now has vertical real estate in it. But I just want to give you kind of an update and be happy to answer any questions if you have any, but this really, so long as it comports with the building code, we'll be moving forward, and there's little, if anything, that we can do to influence it other than the ways that we've influenced it thus far by reducing the height and shifting it as far as we could get them to go. So,
Anybody have any questions on it, Bill?
What sections of the building code would apply here? And if this is all we're going to get eventually, is there any reason why we couldn't review it at this point in time to see if it does comply with the building code?
yeah, I've got their preliminary construction documents, and I'll get those to our department internal that does that. I printed them off this afternoon. I wasn't in receipt of them until late Friday. So, yeah, I've got preliminary construction documents, and certainly they're not final because there's some things I've asked for them to add to what will be final construction documents. But
Seems to me it wouldn't vary much from the tower on Batesville Road, which I assume passed our code review.
correct. I don't have any reason to believe that AMEC, who's putting this plan together for them, is going to bring forward. I mean, if they're going to seal a set of plans, they're going to be plans that meet the building code. When we operate under the telecommunications code in Milton, that would have allowed us to force the tower to be in a different geographic location on the site because we have fall zone requirements and other things, that we could have a little bit of teeth to make it move south, or conversely to not make it appear at all. But we don't have that latitude in our code because, again, it's Fulton County doing something on their property. We can't apply our zoning code to them. We can just apply the building code.
I guess my point is I wouldn't foresee any surprises as far as non-compliance with the code.
No, this is not this company's. This is what they do, so this isn't their first time building a tower.
Matt?
Is there anything we can do as far as a vegetation buffer as well? I mean, we haven't mentioned that, just a question.
Yeah, I talked about that with them Friday and asked for the traditional high-growing Leland tower that would surround the facility itself, the compound itself, recognizing that you can plant Lelands all day long. They don't camouflage the 195-foot piece of metal. Sure. But yes, to the extent we can screen the compound, we've asked for that, and they've indicated they'll comply. And it's indicated on their plans that that's what they intend to do.
Could we extend the screening to the water tower?
I believe it is.
Is it?
I believe it is.
Because you can't really see that too well from the road, just making sure that
The groundwater storage tank that you see sitting there, you can't see from Freemanville or from adjoining areas as it's screened. I mean, you stick something 150 feet up in the sky and you can see it, but
I can see it from Bill's house.
it's nice sky blue, isn't it? Yeah.
Depends on what what the sky looks like.
Yeah, sky blue doesn't look great against gray. So anyway, that's kind of the update. I hope that you're satisfied that we've provided as much of a mark on it as we could, and I truly believe that we have put as much of a mark in protecting our citizens as we could. And I'll be happy to answer any questions as it goes forward. It will potentially be a topic of discussion later this week. The paper that will end up in everybody's driveway this week has the legal ad in it that Motorola has sent out on Fulton County's behalf, seeking any historic interest in this property. It's one of the things you have to do before you can build a tower. It's more a formality than anything, but that legal ad is in this week's paper, so we should start to potentially get some questions about it. Feel free to forward people to me if you get them.
Okay. Anybody else have anything? Thank you for that.
Thank you.
That update. Sudie, on item number 1, the discussion on Arnold Mill vision study. Do we have any public comment?
I do not, sir.
Is there anybody in the audience that would want to speak about the Arnold Mill? Okay. Then if you would read that item.
Our first item this evening is discussion of Arnold Mill visioning study, and this is being presented by Mr. Andrew Smith from Atlanta Regional Commission.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I'll start the presentation. As you know, when the comprehensive plan was passed, it identified several areas within the city that deserve further development. And in the past, we have done visioning studies for both Crabapple and the Deerfield area, and then subsequently went forward with a zoning form-based code overlay for both of those areas. We are now looking at 2 other areas that were identified in the comprehensive plan. One is Arnold Mill corridor, and the other is the Route 9 North area. Both of those have undergone a visioning study during the last year, and they're both being brought to you tonight as drafts for your review. And it's our intent based on the discussion this evening, we would put it on the agenda for next week's meeting. But the first one that we would like to bring forward is the Arnold Mill corridor. We were able to access, and we were delighted to be able to access planning consulting work from the Atlanta Regional Commission. John Tooley and Andrew Smith both worked on this with our long-range planner, Michelle McIntosh Ross, and the draft has been completed. And Andrew Smith from the ARC is here tonight to give you the presentation on this corridor study. So without further ado, I'll introduce Andrew Smith to you. Andrew?
Thank you, Kathy. Mr. Mayor, council members, members of the public, thank you for having me here. And again, as Kathy mentioned, my name is Andrew Smith. I'm with the Atlanta Regional Commission. We, in the last couple of years, have tried to reach out to our local governments wherever we can to offer cost-free planning, advisory services or consulting services if people are looking for kind of a targeted or more short-range study and they need help on it for no cost. We've been trying to help out wherever we can, fit that into our regular work program at the Regional Commission. Just briefly, while we're here, Kathy and Michelle had approached ARC last year to talk about some needs for the Arnold Mill Road corridor, as Kathy mentioned, been identified in the comprehensive plan as an area that needed future study, and so this was designed to be the first step in that process. Kathy and other staff and other folks with the city had mentioned kind of some things in the background that were driving this. They've been getting some increased attention and interest from developers and people, landowners in the corridor, people looking to try to figure out, the future of the corridor. And they've also been, in conversations with folks at Fulton County, at GDOT. They've been, confronted with some different long-range scenarios in terms of infrastructure, both water and sewer, in this part of Fulton County, as well as with Arnold Mill Road itself. And so with all that in mind, they wanted to try to get an outside look and just do a visioning study for this corridor to really bring together viewpoints from the citizens, from the staff, and from other stakeholders who have some kind of relationship to the corridor. And so that's what we try to do, to try to fuse that all together into a long-term vision that kind of can help the city map out what they want to do with this corridor in the long run. In terms of the timeline, real briefly, we started out by just doing some preliminary research and then kicked off with a community workshop in June of last year, and that involved a big community meeting followed by a couple days of kind of more targeted meetings with landowners, other citizens who were just interested in attending, staff members from other departments, as well as planning staff from other jurisdictions that border that part of the city. We went through last summer meeting more in detail with GDOT, the Department of Water Resources at Fulton County, as well as Waste Management, which is the private company that runs the Chadwick Road landfill. In November of last year, we had a kind of a follow-up community meeting to bring back the results of all of those, all of that work that we had done earlier. And then since then, again, we have just been going back and forth with staff, put together a draft that the Planning Commission reviewed and approved in April, and now we're having the council members look at it. So we, I think the city's plan, like Kathy mentioned, is to have it move forward, become part of the city's policies, and then inform, future decision-making for the city. Just real quick background, it's about a 3-mile corridor from about Cherokee County down to approximately Green Road. There's about 520 acres or so in the study area that was identified in the comprehensive plan. It's about 100 parcels, a lot of different land uses. So it's kind of a strange corridor when you look at some of the more traditional suburban development patterns in this part of the county. It still has quite a rural feel in certain stretches. It's got a lot of different agricultural and rural land uses, large lot residential. It's a heavily traveled commuter route, and so that's something that we wanted to look at to try to figure out how to balance that with any future ideas for the corridor. And it's got a lot of historic resources, especially from the mid to late 19th century and early 20th century. Just real briefly, in the comprehensive plan, as I'm sure that you're familiar with, Milton has a kind of an overall mantra of channeling growth to pretty targeted areas within the city, using design standards wherever possible to try to get things that look good and function well, and keeping large swaths of the city in very low-density residential and kind of agricultural uses. In the comp plan for this corridor in particular, there was the idea of avoiding strip commercial development. There was the kind of principle of, again, preserving that rural character and at some point creating a master plan. And this study, I think, is a starting point of that process to have, pull together a vision, and then whether that's implemented through zoning code or otherwise, that's for the city to decide in the future. The zoning in the corridor right now is almost entirely agricultural. There's a little bit of commercial at the northern end of the corridor, as well as a little bit higher density residential zoning at the north end of the corridor as well, as you get towards Cherokee County. Some of the key findings from the June workshop and the November follow-up meeting line up pretty well with what was already in the existing vision within the comprehensive plan. Again, preserving those unique resources, whether it's the rural character or historic properties. Not trying to replicate the commercial development that you find farther south as you get more down into Roswell. Not trying to replicate kind of higher density subdivision models that are prevalent in a lot of the region. Trying to, again, kind of take the citywide mantra and apply it to this corridor to any new growth that might come, channel it into more targeted areas, and then as much as possible for the majority of the corridor maintain that rural character. And then again, think creatively about the ultimate reuse of the landfill, which eventually will close. So those were some of the priorities identified during that process. It was great during this process to be able to get with GDOT and Fulton County folks and staff and kind of have some one-on-one meetings to get on the same page, because there's information that's become dated and new information that's come online about different projects in the corridor. GDOT, as a kind of a standalone project, is going to be replacing the bridge over the Little River into Cherokee County, potentially starting in 2017, and that's just a kind of a one-for-one replacement. So that was something that needed to be thought about. Water and sewer is kind of a much longer term issue. You know, there's very, very limited sewer access or capacity for treatment in this part of the county. Talking with Water Resources, there is the plan in the fairly near future to upgrade the Little River treatment plant, which could potentially service this part of Fulton County, and so it would be effectively a little more than doubling the treatment capacity. And so I think staff's point of view is that looking at new capacity potentially coming online, and then the kind of the economy coming back and more interest from developers coming online, sometime in the future, you might see the city would be in a tough position and might feel, like it was in the city's best interest to, extend sewage lines into this part of Milton, although that's not the policy currently. And then the widening of Arnold Mill. This is a very long-term thing. There have been different iterations of this at very different points in the past. Talking with GDOT, essentially there was one kind of mega project that would have been a 4-laning of Arnold Mill from far up in Cherokee County all the way down through this entire corridor, heading toward Roswell. But the logical starting and ending points for that project could never fully be agreed upon, and that's kind of the turnkey to the project. There's no real large injection of local money that I don't think anyone foresees in the near future. And so what GDOT told us, and it was good to be able to get them in the room for this process to really update the city on their plans, is that this has been pushed to the far reaches of the long-term transportation plan and is sort of on pause or just asleep at the moment. So I think that all of these things kind of operating in the background made it so that the city wanted to try to understand if there's pressures coming into the corridor and then prepare for those to try to maintain the corridor the way that the city wants. So just briefly, I'm going to overview some of the recommendations from the study. Again, preserving those historic and rural resources in the corridor is very important. Avoiding strip commercial and office that's typical in a couple of other parts. These are just examples of other parts of the city, and some zoning categories there that it seemed from through these workshops were probably incompatible with what people want to see in this corridor. Same thing with denser residential. There was a lot of talk about doing something different in this corridor to try to maintain the rural character and not just having it stripped out either by commercial or by just kind of your standard pretty dense residential subdivisions. And then people also thought that townhome and apartment type development was inappropriate for the corridor, and I just put some just examples of other parts of the city that have that type of development briefly. And so the city already has a transfer of development right program, and I think exploring, using that in this corridor to channel density from other parts of the city into very certain, targeted areas of this corridor could be a possibility as a way to use the program that the city already has. And then looking at conservation easements to try to maintain at least, large stretches as rural or low-density residential. Just briefly, the kind of the development insight that we got in terms of what people were thinking about design and development types and uses really foresee just a couple of fairly small nodes or centers along the corridor where development could be channeled, and there would be, strong design standards. People were looking for kind of the historic, rustic, farmhouse aesthetic, that sort of thing, trying to avoid the modern concrete, steel type of look. Nothing fairly tall. People were a little concerned even about 3 stories, although, you can do height in different ways that can be, palatable for different people. But, anywhere from 1 to 2 stories tall, trying to maximize parking in the rear of properties so that you can kind of have properties that maintain sort of a village atmosphere by having the uses pulled up towards the street, trying to accommodate a variety of uses, whether it's residential, office, kind of small-scale retail, educational, that sort of thing. And just a couple of possible locations that came out of this were the area at Arnold Mill and Cox Road, which has a historic trend of non-residential development around it already at that intersection, and a lot of which has been there for a long time. Then leaving a long stretch of the corridor fairly rural until you work your way all the way up to around the Chadwick Store area near Cherokee County. Obviously, one side of that road is in the city of Roswell, and so that would be, you'd only be able to influence what was on the Milton side of the road, but looking to have some sort of node of activity at some in some part of that area. And again, as I'll get to at the end of this, that could tie into potential reuse of the landfill site, which we'll talk about. And again, like I mentioned, there was a high priority placed on keeping the intensity low between nodes, whether it's residential, agricultural, conservation. Another idea that was brought up was conservation subdivisions. Serenbe is down in South Fulton County in the city of Chattahoochee Hills, and that's a way to essentially cluster residences fairly close to each other within a larger development and keep much of it forested or keep much of it preserved instead of having larger lots that are a little bit more spread out. Or the option was there, to really kind of explore a hybrid of those two approaches to channel, development into these one or two activity nodes and have some kind of hybrid of village development and more of the conservation subdivision development. Looking at form-based zoning, it's already, as Kathy mentioned, been implemented in other parts of the city. Keeping, I just kind of put in there some potential equivalents for the rural stretches of the corridor and the kind of village hamlet centers within the corridor. So, putting together ultimately some kind of overview that is somewhere between T2 and T3 in the crabapple could be an equivalent or a model to look at. And then in terms of intensity, something in between T3 and T4 for the village nodes in the corridor could be something to explore. In terms of transportation, that's a big issue. It's a commuter, heavily traveled commuter corridor, as I mentioned, and that's an issue. You don't want to forget about that in the plan. But it averages. This is from a couple years ago, but about 19,000 cars a day, and that's both ways. But the traffic congestion is very, very severe, especially in the morning coming south. And then in the afternoon going the other way, although there's been some small fixes at Cox Road and some more coming online at New Providence Road, which I think are going to be helpful for this corridor instead of exploring kind of a mega project. So, I think just documenting in this study the fact that pursuing a full widening of, trying to stick with that original GDOT plan might be extremely costly, extremely difficult to get all of the coordination there between all the different jurisdictions. And so I just laid out some possible alternatives and some smaller fixes in the plan. These are some of them. A lot of it involves enhanced signage, enhanced signalization, caution lights, that sort of thing, and in some places like at Ranchette Road, some dedicated turn lanes that would help reduce some congestion and make turning movements safer. So I think following the model of what has happened at Cox Road and what's happening at New Providence Road, I think kind of freeing up as many choke points as you can and pursuing a strategy of many small fixes is probably a more feasible plan than waiting to either get on board with or hanging around and doing everything you can to block some 4-lane plan that may not ever really materialize. Generally, pursuing some type of more of a rural parkway aesthetic was important to folks. And then we had some creative folks that I think we're looking for a better east-west connection. There's a lot of folks that get onto Arnold Mill Road, travel a very short distance, and then turn back off because they're kind of going in a broad fashion, more in an east-west pattern. And so looking at in the future, adding local roads, and these would be financed locally, but fairly short stretches where you could connect Cox Road all the way through to New Providence, potentially alleviate a lot of the backups that go on with people just hopping on to Arnold Mill for short stints. And then this is up near the power line easement, kind of a little bit, I believe it's a little bit north of Ranchette Road, and so just very conceptually, but looking at trying to better connect east-west movement for people. Just real briefly, there was a lot of talk about recreation in the meetings and in the plan, and one of the big things is the Chadwick Road landfill. It's a huge piece of property. It's about 100 acres. It's operated by Waste Management. It's fairly inert as far as landfills go. It's construction, demolition debris. It has a lot of assets bordering it, residential neighborhoods, some kind of wooded properties, historic structures, a school, and some water resources. It's got a lot of steep slopes and difficult terrain on that site. The closure, is adjusted annually based on how much waste they've been getting. So there's no fixed closing time. It's just kind of they project it each year. And so right now, based on the volume that they have been getting, it's anywhere from 5 to 8 years out. But it's good to think about that and to try to get ahead of that so that maybe it can become an asset for the city to really, showcase and use for the public benefit. After it's closed, they'll have all kinds of environmental requirements that they will follow. Essentially, they cap it, and then you can't do a whole lot on the top of the mound. Nothing that would penetrate too deeply because they don't want any water infiltration or any leakage of gas or anything like that. But essentially, Waste Management has, in different ways, helped other places around the country repurpose landfills, and so they would be monitoring the site and would are I think interested in proactively working with the city to repurpose it. But again, they would be looking to sell it or lease it, so the city would just be one kind of potential suitor in that process. So these are some of the things that I put in the plan based on a lot of different feedback. I think kind of more the passive uses, especially around the perimeter and up to the top, walking, hiking, biking, could be part of a broader trail network that could be constructed in the future, and that could be kind of an interchange point. Some interesting connection with the little river there. You could connect, to Cherokee County for bikes and pedestrians. Obviously, it's a very high point, so it's scenic viewing. I think is actually something that people were pretty interested in, and going out to the site, you can kind of see why. Kind of again more passive uses were in the set of things that people mentioned as possible uses or reuses, nature preserve, wildlife habitat and that sort of thing. And there's a lot of different ways to connect to different groups, like potentially the UGA co-op extension, Milton Grows Green, other environmental groups to do environmental education, conservation activities and training and things like that. Botanical gardens, community gardens, dog parks. These are all things that are pretty passive as far as recreation goes, but could be feasible on the site. So I think, really the next steps is to really think about the city's capacity to potentially, eventually maybe lease this site. Buying it would probably be extremely cost prohibitive. But getting an environmental engineer to at least start looking at the terrain and what's truly, feasible from an engineering standpoint. Engage, again, with the citizens and with groups that are here in Milton to try to determine the best exact mix of suitable uses, and then start working as soon as possible with Waste Management to really think about, if the city could do something here out of all these options, what could they do and what would be most feasible. So that's, again, kind of an overview of the plan. I put my contact information here, but I'm happy to take questions, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Andrew. We have any questions for Andrew in this presentation?
Quite a bit to digest.
Yeah.
I felt a little bit like the Micro Machines guy from those old commercials. I don't know if you remember those. Talking quite quickly, but again, my contact info is here, and I'm happy to, this is still obviously in draft form, and I think the city staff wants the council to take a good look at it, and any other changes or public feedback that comes through other channels to definitely get it with the right people at the city, and we can edit it as needed. But it's been a pleasure working with Kathy and Michelle on this.
Okay. Go ahead, Bert. And then
Sure.
before, I was going to ask if Kathy or Michelle wants to add anything or if you guys have any input based on this material, but also any input you've gotten, that we've gotten from citizens or stakeholders on this.
We have had some input today from stakeholders who I think are in the audience who would like to add some comments to this presentation at some point. That would be acceptable, certainly. Other than that, we have not heard, and I don't think Michelle has heard either from any other commenters in terms of this. As Andrew mentioned, we have had 2 public meetings on it, and it appears, at this point, aside from the comment we did here today, that we know that there have been no other commenters.
Okay. And do you have a question for Kathy? Isn't it?
Yes. Kathy, what's the schedule for wrapping this up?
Well, tonight is the workshop meeting, and then the intent is, as we've done with the other 2 visioning studies, is to then bring it to the City Council for their review and approval. And that could happen as quickly as next Monday. Or we could, if you have more questions or, a request for information, we could certainly provide that and put off the vote until a later date. But that's the intent.
Given the fact that we started this, in November of last year? Seems to be kind of a short fuse to have it presented tonight and act on it next week. Just my opinion.
Sure.
Okay. Bert, you want to maybe lead into some?
With respect to that, one thing we could do is turn this on. I wouldn't have a problem pushing it to June the 2nd at all, if you all would like some time to. The difference between 7 days from now and 21 days from now is not, in the eternal scheme of things, is not going to materially alter any land use decision in that corridor. So I'll take that. Whatever your feedback is there, we're happy to do either.
Okay. Yeah, maybe before we finish this discussion, let's decide if we want to postpone it.
Quite a bit to
Yeah.
digest.
Right. Bert, you want to address public
I've
comment?
was reached out to by some landowners in the area, and they had a little bit, and I've met with Kathy and Chris, and passed out a couple of little handout to everybody this evening. And their concern was that they felt that the visioning study should set forth general conclusions and development principles in leaving the specific site and design standards to the rezoning process. And they highlighted a few items on here, and I've passed those out to you. And speaking with Chris and Kathy, nothing was offensive or changing anything to the conclusions of the report. It was basically just saying we'll still have to address these issues, but at another time when it comes more site specific. Their main concern is not boxing something in that when it comes time, whether it's 2 years, 3, 4, whatever down the road, that we have a sustainable development that's able to happen, specifically at the 2 commercial nodes that are outlined. So I would like for us to at least look over these few items and at least consider some of those changes, if everybody's agreeable.
And, Chris and I talked about that a little while ago, and I don't know, Kathy, you've looked at that obviously with Bert. If you have any comments on that.
No, that's absolutely fine. I mean, this is a visioning statement, so it could be as general as we wanted it to be. But we will then, if we follow the pattern that we've done with Crabapple and Deerfield, we will, assuming that this is eventually approved by the City Council, we will then take the next step in terms of writing a form-based code zoning overlay to implement the plan. So at that point, we will get into the specifics, but that's perfectly appropriate, and those specifics certainly relate to the zoning part of this process. So we can generalize more with the visioning study, but we will have to get into some type of specifics, obviously, as we develop the zoning overlay.
Anybody?
I would personally, I'd like the 21 days rather than 7 days to digest this document. So,
We're happy to go June the 2nd. We're happy to go June the 16th. You just tell me
but would it require is it gonna require a first reading and then a final one anyway? So if we, or is it all gonna be done in one meeting?
This plan will be done in just one meeting, because you're just adopting it as almost you're adopting it as a vision study that
Okay.
is a guiding document, but not a binding document.
Right.
So you can do that by resolution at a one-read meeting.
Okay, does the council agree that, the majority of council, they'd like to see it move to at least the 20, what did you say, 21st?
June 2nd?
Oh, June 2nd.
I'm fine with that.
Everybody all right with that?
Yeah.
Okay, if staff would
Just
note
make my
that.
review tomorrow a whole lot easier. I'll offer that up all the time. All right, here we go.
And that'll give folks some time to digest
Yeah.
some of these other comments and also answer some questions and whatnot. So,
I just want to say, the comments that we got today, certainly in these public processes, we really appreciate those. So
Yeah.
that's,
yeah.
could never get too many of them.
No, in all these processes, we this is not about the city council, us making decisions for landowners. It's for the good of the entire city, but we certainly need the landowners to, and stakeholders to be a part of that discussion and that direction, so. Bill?
Yeah, going along with that too, having a little more time to review it, I think gets away from the perception that we're trying to ram this thing through, and that's certainly not the intent. I think, given the fact we've been on this thing for 15 months, another 21 days is not going to hurt, and it'll give us more time for the public to review it too.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to add or questions tonight?
I just got one other question. I've got a bunch of Fulton County maps from about 20 years ago that actually showed a cut-through road right where Chadwick's Road landfill is over to New Providence Road. I'm assuming that's kind of out of the equation now.
I don't know when the Providence Lake subdivision exactly was built. You're talking about
Yeah, it actually came through where I guess Mill Springs is now, is where it
Okay,
actually
yeah.
shows it. But I
I
have a
think
bunch of
there's-
Fulton County maps that show it coming right through there.
We had people mention, among other little roads that are kind of not official public roads anymore, people mentioned that used to be a way to cut through. I think it's physically, not feasible just because of the development that's taken place in there since then. And I think it goes down to a very, very low spot because you come right up to the edge of Cooper Sandy Creek, I believe, as it branches off right there. And so, I think thinking about ways for people to cut through is important. I don't know that is one that we took that seriously just because no one was kind of pushing it, and also it just seems it would be cost prohibitive or just very, very difficult to run something through there. But I think again, this is kind of an overall vision and a concept, as Kathy mentioned, and so I definitely want everybody to have a hand in it and take a look at it.
Okay. Thank you, Andrews. Then we'll move that out to June 2nd. And again, want to encourage any of our citizens or neighbors in that area to spread the word, if you don't mind, to give the city their feedback. And we certainly want to hear that and take all facets into consideration. Let's move on to our item number 2. Do we have any public comment, Sudi, on
We do have public comment on the State Route 9. We have 2 public comments.
Okay, all right. So if
Great.
you would call those out, and I believe we've got someone else that would like to speak also with a card.
Our first public comment comes from Mr. Brad Sanderson.
Mr. Mayor, council members, community members, my name is Brad Sanderson, and my wife and I live on the corner of 5 Acre Road and Highway 9, more specifically Special Area 2, which will be presented in the study overlay. First of all, I'd like to give accolades to Kathy and Michelle and Dr. Elliott for taking a pretty emotional topic and making this study go as smoothly as possible. Growth is inevitable, and I hope that everyone chooses to embrace that. Not to be redundant, but as a point of emphasis, I would like to address the City Council regarding the matter at hand, again specifically Special Area 2. After many meetings with community input, mediation, and consensus, a consensus was reached regarding the use of the 8 acres fronting Highway 9 that is designated as Special Area 2. And that's within the City of Milton's Vision Study, State Route 9. I live on approximately 2 acres of those previously mentioned 8 acres, and as an outcome of these community meetings, permitted use, non-permitted use, restrictions, and buffers governing the use of these 8 acres were established and agreed upon by the participants at this meeting. Again, to emphasize, these guidelines were established and agreed upon. Therefore, my wife and I strongly feel that these guidelines, uses, and restrictions should not become more restrictive, because more restrictions would continue to erode even more the viability and variability of the use of our property, directly affecting the marketable value of our property. Thank you for the opportunity to make these comments.
Thank you. Okay, Sudi, if you would please call the next.
And our next speaker is Miss Judy Sanderson.
You're welcome to speak, or if you're just get comfortable and just sit in the room. Tell us what you think.
I'm Judy Sanderson, and I live at the corner of 5 Acre Road and Highway 9. And attended every one of the meetings back, and I don't even know where I started. It seemed like a year ago. And at first, the process just seemed like it would be like an easy thing. You know, we were on Highway 9, and we would be able to be rezoned, and we'd have property rights, and we'd be able to do what we wanted to with our land. I'm from old school. Lived there for about 40 years and knew that we were eventually one day probably going to have to move because it was on a state road. Well, the process went much better than what I thought. It was a very emotional meeting. Many times it was. At first, I didn't think that as we whittled away at all the things, the permitted uses and the non-permitted uses and form-based coding and the setbacks and the buffers, and we talk about this property as 8 acres, but really I'm only responsible for it. I think it's almost 2 acres. And so I kept thinking, with all the setbacks and all that, I would have nothing left to sell and that no one would want it. But then throughout the process, and as things started to evolve, it really became where I felt more comfortable with it. But we did have to compromise, I felt like, a little bit of our property and our property rights, because we did give up our little corner, you know, so that we have an entrance in a 5 Acre Road. And I totally understand that, because if I lived in the back, I would want that too. We do have access to get in, and we did have to give up some of the things that we thought my 2 acres would have been most appropriate for. And I only use this as an example, but I thought a gas station, you know, but please excuse that, on 2 acres might be the only thing that might be best used for that. And of course, in my simple thinking, and you have to remember I'm not in your position, I was thinking, you know, that might be a really good thing coming down Highway 9. We need one on the right-hand side going into work. So I was thinking of all that. And then when it was approached that, you know, with the lighting, you know, that would not be good for our neighbors. They would not, you wouldn't be, and even if I'm still there and they put one next door to me, I would not want that. So I guess what I'm saying is that a lot of the things that we gave, our property did somewhat become compromised through our compromising. And and as it stands right now, I'm somewhat satisfied with the way it turned out, because at first you're thinking, like I said, the broad picture and what you really think you're going to be able to do. And I've learned a lot through the process. But again, like Brad said, my husband, I do feel like any more restrictions that might be put on the use, and I'm sure you've looked at the list of approved uses, we may be able to live with that. Of course, we would like it less restrictive, but as it goes through the process, I'm just hoping that maybe, I know you'll be sensitive to it, but just remember that our home is there, and we have to be able to replace that if we move. And so things that come in, extended buffers and all the form-based coding, I don't know if that affects the buyers or not and the marketability, but if I were buying the property, it would make it harder to buy or more, not as attractive if I had so many restrictions on it. So that's bottom line what I wanted to say, and I hope that I'm not asking too much of you, but again, I am asking to remember through the process that we live there, and we have to replace our 2 acres and in a place we hope in Milton County that we'll like to live as well as we'd like to live there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and sir, I believe we have another comment.
One more comment from Mr. Billy Carmen.
Hello, gentlemen. Thank you. My name is Billy Carmen. I live at 340 5 Acre Road in 5 Acre Estates. And my comments are pretty much the other side of the coin as to what you've just heard. I moved in 5 Acre Estates in 1983, and it was a residential subdivision zoned R2 conditional. And we thought when we moved there we would kind of be protected from that since it was an R2 residential zoning. We've watched the development come up Highway 9. We've been involved with, as most of you know, the landfill, which is now Crooked Creek. We were involved in a dispute about Lake Laurel subdivision. I just have a bad taste in my mouth about land brokers and stuff because they came to my house, showed us a land plan, subdivision layout of Lake Laurel. We agreed on that. They said the state wanted the curb cut to Lake Laurel to be right directly across the street from 5 Acre Road. And as most of you know, it's not across the street from 5 Acre Road. When they cut the curb in, we didn't. When we agreed on the plat, we says, okay, we're good. Well, they started developing. We saw the curb cut, and it wasn't there. We started looking. The land broker had taken out 5 acres of land that the subdivision plat said was going to be the swim tennis area. Well, you know, it's the strip mall now. So I'm just afraid if this development, these 4 lots get rezoned to commercial, we're just in for another disappointment as to what's going to go on it. Yes, we agreed of some of the development uses, but we've also seen some pictures of some of the things that they want to build. It has nothing to do with what we agreed on. This land, I went to all the meetings, the land was referred to as AG1. It's not AG1, it's R2. So I would ask that you just consider breaking up an established subdivision that, by the way, 2 of the lots are residential. They have homes on them. There's 2 vacant lots. You're adding 2 more curb cuts into that curve of Highway 9, which is a dangerous situation, I think. So I would ask that you keep the rezoning or keep the zoning as to R2 as it is now. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Is there any more public comment?
That's all, sir.
We'll close that, and shall do our.
So our next item is discussion of State Route 9 plan, and that's being presented by Ms. Michelle McIntosh Ross.
Hi, good evening. I'm Michelle McIntosh Ross, and I'm with City of Milton Long Range Planning. We're going to talk about the Highway 9 North visioning process. I'll give you a little bit of the background, some of the key findings, and then we'll discuss, and then some next steps. As you all know, the comprehensive plan identified several areas within the city that were future development areas that needed a master plan. We talked about Arnold Mill previously tonight. We also completed plans for the Crabapple area as well as the Deerfield Highway 9 area south of Bethany Bend. As the comprehensive plan referred to the area along Highway 9 and Deerfield as a future development area, we did pursue LCI funding to do a study in that area. However, the study area did not go all the way to Forsyth County line along Highway 9. So after completing the LCI study, which is on the map is outlined on the slide here, we decided as a city to take a look at the areas north of Bethany Bend and do a visioning study along Highway 9 and Bethany Bend to Cogburn to get a visioning study for that area, and also to create a master plan that would give us some direction for a future zoning overlay to match the south portion with obviously some differences in scale, and also to create a nice entrance from Forsyth County into Milton. We went through a visioning process starting all the way back in January of 2013. We had community meetings with HOAs and the general public. We put signs out so that folks could come out and participate. We had a visual preference survey at one of our initial meetings, and we did a map exercise as well. We had community feedback, and based on the results of those meetings and the community feedback, it was determined that 2 of the areas needed to be looked at in some more detail for some additional character detail on those. Then we had a final community meeting in November. So I'll just go into a little bit more detail about the process. As I mentioned, the visual process, we looked at hundreds of pictures, and we did a survey to where the community rated these images. Then we followed that up with using the highest rated images, and they did the map exercise where they put the pictures onto the map, the study area, to show what some of those areas within the Highway 9, what they would want it to look like. And like I said, based on those exercises, it was determined that the 2 special treatment areas needed to be looked at. Before we move into the special treatment areas, the general area for the study, the consensus was that it should be a low-scale area with 2-story buildings or so, with a mix of uses, office and residential, and some retail. The building should address the street and keep within the context of the Highway 9 widening, the future Highway 9 widening. Community members wanted increased walkability along Highway 9, and also the characteristics of the architecture. They wanted to keep that within the Milton look, keep pitched roofs and the residential look. And also, as I mentioned, Highway 9 as a gateway from Forsyth County. So these are the 2 special treatment areas. There's special treatment area number 1, which is along Bethany Bend to Cogburn in the pink, and special treatment area 2 in a sort of a peach color, which is, was mentioned earlier, the 5 acres road. Both of these special treatment areas went through a separate series of meetings where we used a facilitator, Dr. Elliott, to manage the group meetings. We identified the issues that the community had, and we addressed the concerns, and for both of the areas, a consensus was reached. As far as special treatment area 1, along Bethany Bend and Cogburn, this area had an application for rezoning with it, and it was discussed at the it was discussed at the meetings. Several iterations of the proposed plans were brought to the meeting and discussed. Concerns were addressed. The final plan that was reached, there was a list of conditions attached that moved forward to the City Council. And if you remember, in December of 2013, that rezoning came before you, and it was decided to rezone from AG1 to NUP for 27 homes, and that was passed in December of 2013. So that resolved the special treatment area 1. Now, special treatment area 2, which is 5 Acres Road, this area had no preconceived plans. These are all individually zoned. There are 4 parcels, each at roughly 2 acres each. And so the community came up with a list of acceptable and unacceptable uses for any future development that may come forward. We talked about the architectural style, having dormers and pitched roofs, etc. And as you can see on some of these images, we had some renderings done that reflected what the community thought. We also discussed buffers, plantings, and ingress and egress, meaning that we decided that the entrances to any of the parcels that may be non-residential would have to come off of Highway 9, and you won't have any access along 5 acres. If you look at that bottom picture, you would see that's an image looking from Highway 9 into 5 Acres Road, and so if those parcels did become something other than residential, it would be heavily buffered to where residents going into 5 acres would not see the non-residential uses on either side. We also talked about a signage, and as you can see, there's a pillar post sign design that was discussed, and in the actual document there's several of the other examples that some people liked, but this is the rendering that we decided to put in the plan. And also the horseboard, the 4-board horse fencing. We wanted to keep that on that area. This looks at the next steps for this plan and also the Arnold Mill plan. We had the draft visioning go before the Planning Commission on March 26th, and then we followed up with another meeting with the Planning Commission on April 23rd. Planning Commission approved and recommended that these drafts move forward. And we're here today, May 12th, for you guys to take a look at this plan. And then both plans, the vision is that we would potentially do a form-based code overlay, and that will take on its own process with public meetings. Based on, if we approve these, whether it be next Monday or in June 2nd, then we would initiate the form-based code process. And start having meetings on that. And of course, that will go to the Planning Commission again and come back to the Council. And it's usually a 3 to 6 month process. And so potentially we could be back reviewing a form-based code in February or so, based on how long it takes. Any discussion on the Highway 9 North plan?
I'll just open up to anybody discussion or questions, but, we may want to, as Michelle mentioned, we may want to move this one forward too, to give us a little bit more time to get some more feedback. And the other thing, you may even want to, I'll just take suggestions whether we should move it to a different night or have both of them the same night. If we think it may take more time. So, Rick?
I guess I would put that forward, that we actually push it out, give us a little bit more time to get the community input. I don't know if we can consider both of these on the same night. I guess that's where I'd be open to input, but I know we have different opinions, I think, from the community on this one.
Sure. Anybody else?
I'm okay with moving it if we need to.
But I do agree, it'd probably be better if they weren't on the same night. There's
Yeah.
an awful lot of vision.
To the second
Yeah.
regular meeting.
Yeah, maybe,
Just the
Stacy,
latter part of the month.
June 16th meeting.
if that's okay. And again, we could look at the agenda, as it's time, if we need to adjust it a little bit. But
Okay, that would be good.
any other questions, though, or comments?
I just have one, this is the schedule that we got. This is about the State Route 9 widening from GDOT. Public Works passed this on, and this is just for information purposes, that meetings will be held in May and June. GDOT will host those meetings. There'll be a concept plan approval, possibly. Their timeline is this fall of 2014, following up with environmental approval 2016, and then they'll begin right-of-way acquisition in 2019, and supposedly end of road construction 2024. So this is GDOT's timeline for imminent projects. So 2024.
Sure. 10 years, if they stay on schedule.
Right, exactly.
Okay. Anything else for Michelle or staff?
So I'll
Bill?
be back in 2 seconds.
Just commend them. There was a lot of work put into this, and I know they engaged the community out there, and I think it was a great effort and a great example of how we can get the community together on issues like this. Good, I think it's a good product.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would say, just to second that, I've been through a lot of the meetings as well from the beginning, and I know how, from a community perspective, how emotional it can be, but I was impressed by the process. I know that there was a lot of just understanding that needed to happen by the community and by ourselves as a city as well, and we eventually got everybody working together, and I think that was the overall end of it, even though we may still have some ideas and different visions as far as that goes. That's why we'll give it a few more weeks for more community input, but just good job on that end. So.
And I'd like to thank our community and the citizens and property owners that spoke tonight. And again, pass the word on to your neighbors too, that we would like to have input if they have any input on it. And just to let you guys know that we certainly listen. Sometimes we get put in a hard situation here because we got to look at not only what's right for the property owners, but also how affected property owners, how they're affected. So we try to do the best balance that we can and make the best decisions, but input from both property owners and affected property owners certainly helps. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Not, Sudie, if we can move on to our next item.
Okay, our next item, we have no public comment, is discussion of retirement plan for new employees. And that's being presented by Mr. Sam Traeger. Well, we moved. Yeah, we moved.
Good evening. As Sudie just said, we're here tonight to discuss the pension plan and the changes that we're looking at making toward a defined contribution plan, especially for new employees. What I wanted to start out with, two things, was sort of a review of our current plan and where we are with the defined benefit and the defined contribution we currently offer. Right now, we have a Social Security replacement plan where the city pays 3.75% of salary in, as well as the employees pay 3.75%. Those go into 401 and 457 vehicles. We also have the defined benefit plan. Right now, the city pays 9% into that plan, although the minimum contribution that's required is 5.8, when it's going up a little bit in October of 2014. We pay at that level because the thought was, when we had a new funding agreement, I think it was back in 2012, that we sort of would smooth out the curve and the expenses over time of the DB pension plan by funding it a little bit higher now, as was recommended, to sort of smooth that out over the long term. We also have another deferred compensation plan where if the employee pays into a 457 or puts money in a 457, the city matches up to 1% of their salary if they contribute 2%. So if you total all those costs up, the city currently pays 13.75% into pension plans, and the employee pays a minimum of 6.75 plus whatever else they save on their own. A little bit of more background on how we got to this point, looking at this new defined contribution plan for our new employees. During the March 17, 2014 meeting, Council asked that we explore moving toward that defined contribution plan, retirement plan for employees hired on or after July 1st, 2014. As we were looking at plan design, we determined the best thing to do would be current employees would stay in the current defined benefit retirement plan, and new employees hired after that date would go into the defined contribution plan. Sort of a true line in the sand concept on pensions. It raised several issues that we thought we needed to have our actuaries take a look at. So we posed some questions. I'll show you what those are in just one second. We also did some surveying of some other jurisdictions to determine what level of pension benefits they offered their employees. The effort was, of course, to attempt to look for comparative comparable plans as well as where we are competitively in the marketplace. We asked 3 primary questions of our actuaries as we were going through this process. By basically freezing the current DB plan to new employees, what's that going to do for our long-term funding? We also asked what the minimum defined contribution plan design would be that would provide a comparable benefit to new employees that our current employees have under the current defined benefit plan. And what we also wanted to look at was what would an actuarial table look like if we were reducing the early retirement benefit under the defined benefit plan from 50% to 30%. And what that means is, and I'll get into a little more detail as we go through this, is that right now employees at normal retirement age is 65 under the defined benefit pension plan. Employees can leave at age 55 with 10 years of service, and they have a 50% reduction in that plan benefit. So we asked them, looking at what would it look like if we went to a 30% reduction, and it would be phased in from over those 10 years at 3% per year rather than 5%. I'll show you that in a minute. The first question we ask is, what's long-term funding going to look like if we close the plan to our new participants and opened up that defined contribution plan? We want to know what the DB plan was going to look like over time. If you look at this, there's a bunch of lines going all kinds of different places. So let me try to sort those out for you and show you what the really important lines are. The first important line is the red squares, and that shows what our projected funding level would be if we just left the plan completely alone. The defined benefit plan would probably be funded somewhere around 6% for the next 30 years. The second plan is sort of that thin line that goes between 8 and 10%, right at 9. That's where we're currently funding the defined benefit pension plan. So we're putting 9% in. So that's our current funding level. The third line is the, I'm a little colorblind, but it's the green triangles up top on that line. That's what the projection of the funding is going to be over the next 30 years if we close the plan to new employees and just have our current employees continue right out in the defined benefit pension plan. You can see as a percentage of payroll, it's going to make the plan go pretty much all over the place, ultimately leading to almost a 16% funding requirement in about 2035. So it's going to make that more volatile. It'll stay pretty stable, but it'll be up and down years, so we can expect more of those under the DB plan as we move forward. We wanted to be able to get those numbers and see what it was going to look like over time. As a total percentage of payroll is that final little blue line down there, and you can see as a percentage of payroll that drops over time. But what we really compare, and the real number there, is how much we're paying for our current employees in the DB plan, and it has a percentage of payroll, and that's what's going to go up considerably. Our funding, the plan remains well funded. We're currently at about 85% funding level, which is very good. Over the course of about the next 10 years or so, we'll approach 100% and remain fully funded over the next 20 years after that. The second question that we asked our actuaries was determine a comparable benefit as far as income replacement goes. There's 2 different charts, a line chart and a bar chart's going on here, but this, I think, was the best way to express this. The line chart up there that starts at 83 and ends at 55% is what our current plan expected income replacement level would be of each of these employees if they're hired at 35, 40, and 45 years of age when they retire at age 65. So roughly, if you're hired at age 35 and you stay here for the 30 years, you'll have a benefit of about 83% of your salary under the defined benefit pension plan when you retire. If you're hired at age 45, you have about a 55% benefit after 20 years of service to the city. The bar charts that are underneath that represent income replacement levels of where the defined benefit plan needs to be in order to provide a similar level of benefit that our DB plan does. And the bar charts go up. The red on the left, far left, is 10%, the DC contribution, 15%, 20%, and finally the green bars are 25% of the defined contribution plan. And that's what closest matches our current plan. So about 25% total contribution between the employer and the employee would provide a very similar benefit to what we currently have with the DB plan for our new employees coming in. And we compared this with the market and what other places are doing. We looked at some of our immediate neighbors, Sandy Springs, Johns Creek, Roswell, Dunwoody, Brookhaven, and Alpharetta. And it varies. Probably the fifth column over is total city contributions. And that's how much the city in and of itself is paying toward the defined contribution plan to fund these plans in those cities. Sandy Springs is currently funding at 23.2%. They do participate in Social Security, so 6.2% of that is going directly into Social Security on their behalf. Johns Creek is a mirror of that plan. Their city's total contribution is 23.2%. Roswell and Alpharetta have similar plans, but instead of a 12% match, they only do a 10% match. Their total contribution into the plans are about 21.2% to fund their defined contribution pension plans of payroll. Dunwoody and Brookhaven come in at about 16.2%. They don't have quite as the same plan as Sandy Springs and Johns Creek. They also are both exempt from Social Security, similar to the city of Milton, and they fund their pension plans similarly, but at a little bit lower contribution rate. So that matches up pretty well with where our actuaries said we needed to be for a defined contribution replacement plan for the DB. So in order for us to attract and retain employees qualified to serve the citizens of Milton, we're able to make the following recommendations on how we'd like to see a defined contribution pension plan designed. Since the city is exempt from Social Security, we'd like to start with that as a base, and the city would contribute 6.2% into a Social Security replacement, and the employees would also have a mandatory 6.2% that they'd have to contribute into a Social Security replacement plan or defined contribution plan of their own. We also then wanted to mirror some of the plan that Brookhaven currently has, or very close to it, where the city would match up to 12%. It's a 2-for-1 match. So if an employee contributes 6% of their salary, the city would contribute 12%. And that's purely voluntary on the employee side. But the thought there is, instead of just giving it to them, as some of the other plan designs are, we wanted to have the employees have some skin in the game, make their own investment, have to put some of their own money in order to get the match, and make it more of a match rather than just a simple contribution on behalf or to the employee. Where that left us was, on our recommendation, is the total cost to the city of 18.2%, which, if you look back at this chart, puts us in line comparable with Dunwoody and Brookhaven, just a couple percentage points higher, but below the jurisdictions of Sandy Springs, Johns Creek, Brookhaven, and Alpharetta. We feel this would be a pretty competitive benefit for our employees and would do a good job of replacing our current DB pension plan for those coming on board after July 1st. I mentioned this reduction in early retirement. Over my 5 years working with the city, I think one of the common themes that I hear from both police and fire is that the minimum retirement, they see the retirement age as being 65. Those are both very strenuous, stressful jobs, and they would like a way to get out earlier if they can. The thing that I've been pleased with our current DB plan about is we've always kept a very conservative approach. And instead of us opening up and saying you can go at 100% benefit at age 55, we wanted to look for something that would make it more palatable for them to leave if they wanted to at a little bit earlier age, but didn't want to just say the current age is 55. So we looked at what would be a way to do that. We looked at this actual reduction table, and I mentioned it earlier. Right now, under our current plan, if the employee retires at age 50, they have a 50% reduction. So in other words, if their retirement benefit would be $2,000 a month, they'd get $1,000 a month for the rest of their life. They receive it for that 10 years earlier. And that varies down to, if they retire at 65 years early, they'd get 25% reduction. What we'd like to see happen, and what this recommends, is to move it to a 30% reduction. So it's 3% per year. They would lose $600 if they retire at age 55 if they have that same $2,000 benefit. I'm making it $1,400 instead of $1,000. It would drop down to about 15% if they leave at age 60 and 5 years early. So it makes it little bit better for early retirement. The cost of this is about 0.86% per year for the next, at least next 20 years is what the actuary came back with. It's about $57,000 a year right now. I'd suggest that the money that we put into the previous funding agreement, where we're funding it at 9%, would cover this over the course of those years, because we're funding at DB plan at a little bit higher level, based on that funding agreement that would reduce the volatility that I talked about earlier. And again, it would encourage early retirements, allowing more movement of new employees coming in to go to that DC plan. Over the course of the next couple months, we're going to come forward with some plan design changes, there's an ordinance to amend the current pension plan that you'll see on the June 2nd and June 16th meeting that would basically effectively say that no new employees after July 1 would go into the defined benefit plan. You'll see that again at the meetings in June. We'll also like to come back with some documents to start up this defined contribution plan. And what we like is to know that we have the support of the proposed defined contribution plans that we outlined on page 10, and also look to move toward this reduction in the early retirement actuarial tables. I thought Andrew spoke fast. I probably went a little bit quicker than he did even. Are there any questions that I can answer for you guys?
Can you send us a copy of that?
Sure. I can
We'll
get that
have
up.
those numbers to actually look at.
Yeah, I guess I like where we're going on that end. I guess what I want to see is on the reduction of the defined benefit actuarial tables. Some kind of just a graph on that to see. I'm trying to wrap my head around that. So obviously, if people can retire early, yet we give them more money for retiring early, then because we're moving people into the DC plan, that therefore the city long-term will save money ultimately, or will that just smooth it out?
And
Is that
also,
what we're doing?
and we tried to sort of picture that graph, I think, once or twice in my head. You would have movement in the fact that employees who were at age 55 and above, who might look at the early retirement window, would probably replace in police and fire with people at the minimum starting salaries.
Sure.
So you'd have that savings also accompanying this. So we can work on a chart that would show where that is, because there's also the payout that somebody would get, that if they had a $2,000 benefit at age 65, they get $1,000 for 10 years prior to that, less, or they'd get $1,000 they otherwise weren't getting, where that would all work out. So we can work on trying to have some charts
I think that would help the whole council as a whole. And I'm just kind of surprised as well. I didn't realize a lot of cities were paying a 2-to-1 contribution match. I mean, most corporations are 1-for-1, if that.
Well,
I'm
and
just
it
curious
was
how that works.
that was modeled after the city of Brookhaven. I talked with the director down there last week or week before about their plan design. That seemed sort of better to me than the design of Johns Creek and Roswell, where they just simply give the employees 12% without them having to do anything.
Right.
I wanted to know that our employees were saving some on their own, as well as that old retirement's the three-legged stool concept. They're putting some into it.
I guess my thing is, all of in the private sector, we have to put in 1% to get 1%.
Right.
Not put in 1% to get 2%. So that was kind of the surprise.
And again, in order to remain competitive in the market, we were looking at either just simply the standard model in those jurisdictions, and you'll see it when we send out the presentation, is they just simply give it to the employees.
Sure.
That there's no match. They don't have to do anything. It was Brookhaven that had the plan design that they have to do something in order to get the money and to get that 10 or 12%.
And I might just add to that comment too, and totally understand where Matt's coming from on the private sector, but the reality, we have to realize that the private sector versus a lot of our employees, there's different pay rates, there's different ups and downs with incomes, and most of the folks that work for the city have a steady but slow increase, and versus a lot of private, you may not have as many perks, but you may get a 50% bonus one year, or 100% or double your income, so it averages out.
The way that it's designed, it is a very generous match.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure. I just didn't know that was pretty standard. quite honestly. And I guess the last question too, the green graph going up and down at the very end with the 16%.
Yes.
That's based on the actuarial tables of the age of the employees on the DB plan as far as how they would go through the process, correct?
Yeah, could you pull that back up? I was going to ask you a
Dave?
question about that.
And just to make sure I understand that, the idea is that the city as a whole, because we're getting new employees coming in, even though we're still paying the DB benefit on that, we make up for it on the new employees coming in lower salaries to be able to make that adjustment, right?
And here's that chart that we were discussing earlier. Again, the red boxes, I don't have it up on mine. The red boxes represent where we project funding to be at about that 6% level going forward. What the green bars, the green triangles up top represent, again, is we're freezing the plan. So there aren't any new participants coming in. So because of that, the expectation is that there's not as much turnover. Funding required will stay with the employees who are in the plan. They'll become vested. Our turnover will be lower in that group. So that's why the funding is going to go higher in the DB plan over time, based on only that one group of employees.
So it's making
still
the
here.
assumption that these employees will be with you until they retire. For
Once
those that are
once
in the plan.
Once they're vested, the likelihood of turnover goes down. The amount of turnover goes down over time. Typically, most employees who turn over go in the first 5 to 7 years. And typically in a defined benefit scenario, that's a very good thing for pension plans, is to get that funding in. The funding stays with the plan, but those employees don't get any of it. It stays to fund the pension plan long term. What this assumes is that our turnover is going to go down over time, because the people who will be left are primarily the ones who are vested in the pension plan and will stay with us.
What is the vesting like on the defined contribution plan?
We haven't developed those details yet. The most typical that I've seen is sort of a 5-year cliff where you vest 20% per year. So after 3 years, you'd be 60% vested in what's in there. Right. After 5 years, you're 100% vested.
So there would still be probably some forfeitures in that plan too.
Yes, ma'am.
Is there a way to do it instead of going from 50 to 30% reduction? Do it also based on number of years of service, so that somebody who's been with you for 25 years isn't treated the same as somebody who's been with you for 10 years?
We could look at that. We could put in a rule of, I've seen a lot of plans that have sort of a rule of 75 or something like that, where age plus experience add together get you to this point. It's something that I can talk with the actuaries about.
Because I think that would be a good thing too, because you want to reward the employees that have been with you the longest. I think it's good to reward them.
We can look into that.
And I guess the investment selections are all going to be handled with Georgia Municipal Association. They take care of all that.
As far as the new defined contribution plan, we're currently under our current DC plan. We're with ICMARC. One of the employees recently brought forward to me sort of what their total fees are on all their funds. And I think as we go through this process, I'd like to look at a couple other vendors. There's no intention of putting it directly with GMA right now. It seems their fees are less than what I was looking at ICMA. But I think that I need to look at a couple other providers as well to see where they are and get the plans that are best for our employees.
Sure.
Good. Anybody else? Question, comments? Joe, smiling?
No, that green line is very confusing because it scares me. I don't know why it scares me. I think it scares me because it goes up and down so darn much. But when you put it in the context of what it really is, I mean, it's a very small amount of money, so I'm not sure.
Well, it's also based on a whole lot of assumptions that you have
Right,
no idea.
Right.
You know.
I want to meet the guy who could pick that particular pattern out of over 40 years. So
yeah, it would be interesting to see what the pattern actually is, looking backwards compared to what their little.
We should all be comfortable because in about 30 years it's going to start trending down. We're all sitting here.
There's be a lot of comfort.
Okay, so you're gonna get us this presentation electronically. With Karen and Matt had a couple comments. Karen had asked for to look at some options of sliding scale on terms of employment versus retirement ages and benefits. What else? Anybody else? Everything in general, everybody okay? Kind of looking into this direction is kind of what we've been talking about. Okay. All right. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you.
And I'm going to have to step out, so Joe, if you can do this last item, which I'll call the last
bet.
item. Sudie, if you'll call that.
We have no public comment on the last item, and this is the discussion of Community Development Block Grant 2015 Cooperative Agreement, and Ms. Michelle McIntosh Ross.
Okay, so
Step to adjourn.
Okay, I think I can handle it, Joe.
We don't have to vote though.
I'll try
Do you
hard.
need the candy?
No, I'm good.
Look at all those wrappers.
okay, great. So we'll just talk about the community development block grant, the CDBG, real quick. I'll give you an overview and then show you Milton's role and possible funding, possible amounts, as well as possible projects. Okay, so here's the overview. Fulton County, the county that we're in, applies to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, better known as HUD, for this CDBG funding. A portion of Fulton County's award, whatever it turns out to be, is then distributed to the participating municipalities, as well as Fulton County also awards nonprofits and other folks that may make applications to them. So they award a portion of the money that they receive to competitive grant application grantees. How they've done it in the past and how they plan to continue doing it is 33% of what they receive usually goes to the 12 participating municipalities. And to the left, you'll see all of the participating municipalities: Alpharetta, Chattahoochee Hills, College Park, East Point, Fairburn, unincorporated areas of Fulton County, Hapeville, Milton, Mountain Park, Palmetto, Union City, and Johns Creek. They are planning to come back in, so I put an asterisk waiting final determination, but it's expected that they'll be back in under the Fulton County. Now, the non-participating municipalities are Atlanta, Sandy Springs, and Roswell. They go directly to HUD and apply for their funds. Okay, Milton's role and possible funding. Now, Fulton County again will be submitting an application to HUD for these CDBG funds, and they're asking each of the participating municipalities to review and sign a cooperative agreement stating that we'll participate and we agree to their process and stipulations and so on. We will be receiving this cooperative agreement on June 5th, and then we'll send it to legal and have it reviewed. We'll bring that back to the City Council meeting on June 16th. We'll talk about it, and we'll make a decision as far as whether we're going to execute that agreement. Based on the calculations from previous funding years, our portion of the 33% that goes to municipalities would probably be $160,000 over the 3 years. 2015, 2016, and 2017, the upcoming funding cycle. Now, we did have a meeting. Yes, question.
Is that 160 total over 3 years, or 160 each?
Yeah.
160, 160, and 160.
No.
Total. Gotcha.
What about for the previous 3 years?
Exactly. We had a meeting with Mike Rowicki last week, and Stacy was in there. And so we are going to try to get the 2013, 2014 funding that we did not use yet. They said that we can still use that. We may not get the 2012. That's already been spent, but 2013 and 2014 we'll be able to get. That's about $106,000. And we can use that and put it with the possible $160 that we'll get for the
So
next
it'll be
funding.
about 200.
Correct.
$270,000 total.
Yep. And so that's the amount. And so here are some possible projects that we talked about. This is an aerial map of the Hopewell House. You can see the label, and then the church area where the parking is proposed to be for the senior center when we do convert the Hopewell House into a senior center. So the thought is we can use CDBG funding to do an ADA accessible sidewalk along from the parking lot to the Hopewell House site. So that would be a project that would be eligible. We could use the CDBG fundings for it. We could do the sidewalk installation as well as all of the ADA improvements from the church parking lot to the facility. And I talked with Sarah, and that doesn't get us quite to the 200,000, but we can find some other projects as well. This is an example of a project that used CDBG funding in Roswell, the Oak Street Sidewalk Project. This is an example of what we can do with the sidewalks from church parking lot to the Hopewell House. So it includes not just the ADA, but also aesthetic type improvements. Also, at our meeting with MicroWiki, we talked about other ADA improvements on site at the Hopewell House, and I mentioned the covered driveway that we can put on for a bus drop-off. He said that would be eligible as well. So this is an example of a covered bus drive area at the Dorothy Benson Senior Center, and so we can use funding to attach one of this at the Hopewell House to help with the bus drop-off for the senior center. So that is also a possible project. And as you know, we have other upcoming park projects, Broadwell Park. We could do sidewalks along there on Broadwell Road and so on. So I think we have some projects that we can use this money for. So any questions?
This is the same money we originally talked about using for improvements to the Hopewell House itself. And we decided that because of what we'd have to go through for the actual improvements, it was going to cost more than it was worth. But yet the sidewalks and stuff are very specific projects that really the cost would not be any more if we did it on our own, or much more if we did it on our own or using these funds. So these would probably be a good use of these funds.
I think so too, especially that we are doing that intersection improvement at Birmingham Road and Hopewell with the roundabout and some additional. So that project will already be opened up, and so we'll just add CDBG money to extend the sidewalk. So it's not a whole new project, but administrative, work and so on.
And one of the main things too is tying it to ADA accessibility. That was one of the. It's on. That was one of the things that they said that we need to focus on is ADA accessibility, and that's one thing we can tie directly to the sidewalk. And there's also all the laws that go along with the Davis-Bacon Act and all of the different labor laws and everything that goes along with this type of project. So we thought that the sidewalk itself would be a good one to do.
So are these, and along that vein, I remember when we were discussing these funds for operation of the Hopewell House, where there was such a, had to prove X amount of income.
That was for low income, low to mod income.
Stuff. Put a plaque up honoring Fulton County for letting us have some of this money. Is all that stuff out the window for this type of
for
use?
ADA accessibility?
Okay.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned the previous money. We are looking at the previous money as well as future money.
Okay.
Yeah, 2015 to 2017
So
money.
it'll be approximately 50,000. If this continues, it'd be about 50,000 per year that we could use for sidewalks. And we just need to figure out where we're going to use, where we need the ADA accessible sidewalks, and make sure that we use these funds for that type of project.
Yeah.
So I guess just to be clear on that, and to Bert's point then, we're not going to have to comply with all of the other onerous requirements then.
Right. There are requirements still now, right. But that issue that we had with having folks who attended the Hopewell House or the senior center, having them to fill out the surveys and so on, we won't have that issue anymore.
Right, and because the ADA is a protected class. And so therefore, if it's ADA accessible, it goes across all boundaries of low and moderate income or not.
So that they automatically qualify without us having to go through all the hoops.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yes.
We'll take it.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so we'll come back with the agreement after legal reviews it, and you'll determine at that time. Okay, thank you.
All right.
Let's wrap this up.
That's it, City? All right, so we're adjourned then.